Her knees buckled first. Then her arms went up, not to protect herself, but to shield a 9-year-old girl she had met 11 minutes earlier. 79 years old, wearing a coat too thin for the cold snapping through the park that afternoon, she took the first blow meant for a child square across her shoulder and did not move out of the way. 3 boys stood over her, breathing hard, unsure for a moment what to do with an old woman who wouldn't get up and wouldn't step aside. She had no home to go back to that night beyond a cinder-block shed 40 yards away, no family to call. Nothing that most people would call a reason to risk what little safety she had left. She did it anyway. Across the parking lot, a man in a leather cut was already running full out toward them, and he was still 200 feet away. What the local Hells Angels chapter did in the hours and days that followed would change more than one life on that block for good. Meadowbrook Park sat at the edge of Pinewood Falls, Kentucky. 3 baseball diamonds and a chain-link backstop gone rusty at the seam. The kind of park that filled up with kids after school, let out and emptied fast once the streetlights buzzed on. Behind the concession stand, a squat cinder-block equipment shed had sat mostly forgotten by the Parks Department for years, and for the last 11 months, it had quietly become home to a woman most families in Pinewood Falls had learned not to look at too closely. The smell of cut grass and vending machine popcorn hung over the diamonds most afternoons, along with the metallic clang of an aluminum bat that never seemed to stop somewhere on the field. 20 years ago, this same park had hosted a Little League tournament that drew half the county. These days, the bleachers sat mostly empty except for a handful of parents scrolling their phones, waiting out the after-school program the way people wait out a red light. Jake Rios had been a patched member of the local Hells Angels chapter for 11 years, and at 45 he had built his whole schedule around one thing: getting to Meadowbrook by 4:15 to pick up his daughter Daisy from the after-school program that let out at the ball field gate. He'd raised her alone since her mother left 3 winters back, and he'd learned to be early rather than on time. Because the 2 minutes between when the program ended and when a parent showed up were, in his experience, the 2 minutes where a 9-year-old could decide the whole rest of her day had gone wrong. He worked mornings at a diesel shop 40 minutes out and rode straight from the bay to the park most days without stopping to change out of his coveralls, grease still under his fingernails. He carried a private weight most people at the shop never asked about. A brother in the chapter named Denny who'd overdosed the year before. In the same month, Daisy's mother packed a bag and didn't come back, and Jake had never quite found a way to talk about either loss out loud. Some nights, sitting in his truck outside the school gate 10 minutes early, he practiced the words anyway, just to himself, in case the day ever came when he needed them. Before we get to what happened at the ball field that afternoon, hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. I read every single one of them. Now, back to Meadowbrook Park. Because in the next 10 minutes, an old woman nobody in that town had bothered to learn the name of was about to become the reason a 9-year-old girl is safe today. Her name was Odessa Mae Coleman, and for 38 years she had been the church pianist and after-school piano teacher for half the children in Pinewood Falls. The kind of woman who kept a dish of peppermints on top of the upright piano so a nervous 7-year-old had something to hold before a recital. She had never married, had outlived both her siblings, and had raised no children of her own, though at least 3 generations of the town's families would have said she'd had a hand in raising theirs. Her students used to say she could hear a wrong note from the kitchen with the water running, and for decades her Saturday recitals had been the one thing on the church calendar that never once got canceled. Not for weather, not for anything. When her landlord sold the building she'd rented for 30 years, and the new owner tripled the rent inside a single month, Odessa's savings, thinned already by a broken hip and the physical therapy that followed it, ran out faster than anyone expected. She had told no one at the church what had happened to her, too proud to ask, and too embarrassed to be asked back. The same congregation that had sung at every one of her recitals, never once learning where their pianist had gone. For the last 11 months she had slept in the equipment shed behind the Meadowbrook concession stand on a cot she'd carried there herself, one folded blanket at a time, keeping her few remaining belongings in 2 suitcases stacked neatly against the cinder block wall the way she'd once kept sheet music alphabetized on a shelf. She still kept a tin of peppermints in her coat pocket, out of the same old habit, and handed them to any child who looked like they needed one, which was most of them, one way or another. She came to the same bench near third base every afternoon, around 3:30, not to be seen, but because the sound of children playing was the closest thing she had left to the music room she used to run. She had noticed Daisy Reyes before, the way she noticed most of the regulars, a quiet girl who sat by herself most days with a second-hand coat 2 sizes too big, sleeves rolled up twice at the cuff. The week before, Odessa had finally worked up the nerve to sit down beside her. Daisy had been picking at a loose thread on her coat sleeve, and Odessa had held out the peppermint tin without a word. "I used to keep these for my students," Odessa had said. The nervous ones always did better with something to hold. Daisy had taken one, unwrapped it slowly, and after a while asked Odessa if she'd ever taught anyone who was scared of everything. Odessa had laughed, a real laugh, the first one in longer than she could easily remember, and told her that most of the best piano players she'd ever taught had started out scared of everything, and that the fear was never really the problem people thought it was. It was the only conversation of more than a few words either of them had had with another living soul that whole week, and neither one mentioned it to anyone, though both of them thought about it more than once before Thursday came around again. Chase Bowen was 15, big for his age, and had been finding smaller kids to corner behind the concession stand since middle school, without ever facing much more than a stern word from a teacher. His father sat on the town council and had twice called the school directly when Chase's name came up in an incident report, and both times the report had quietly gone nowhere, the assistant principal deciding it wasn't worth the fight. Chase had learned, the way boys like him learn early, that the usual consequences simply didn't reach him, and that knowledge had made him bolder every year since. The way a fence with no current running through it stops looking like a fence at all. His mother had mentioned once to a friend that she worried about him, and had been told by her husband that boys work things out themselves and that she was making a habit out of nothing. He and 2 friends, Riley Kutz and Cody Ferris, had taken to waiting for Daisy Reyes by the gate most Thursdays, mocking the state of her coat, knocking her books out of her arms, once shoving her hard enough into the chain-link fence that she'd worn the pattern of it on her cheek for a day. Daisy had told no one, the same way Odessa had told no one, each of them carrying a private shame that had nothing to do with anything they'd actually done wrong. She had started leaving the after-school program 4 minutes early some days, just to beat them to the gate, a small daily calculation her father never learned she was making. That Thursday, the boys caught Daisy alone behind the concession stand a full 10 minutes before her father's truck was due, the after-school program having let out a few minutes early for a staff meeting nobody had bothered to tell the parents about. Chase shoved her hard enough to put her on the ground, and when she tried to get back up, Riley shoved her down a second time, laughing, while Cody blocked the narrow gap between the shed and the fence so she couldn't get past them toward the field. Odessa Mae Coleman, 79 years old and 40 feet away on her bench, was on her feet before she fully decided to be, moving faster than her hip had let her move in over a year. She didn't shout for help first. She got there first, and only then did she call out, sharp enough to make all 3 boys turn. "That's enough," she said. "Leave her be." Chase laughed at her, the way he'd learned to laugh at every adult who'd ever tried to stop him before, and told her to mind her own business, that this had nothing to do with some homeless old woman who ought to be somewhere else. Odessa didn't move. She put herself directly between the boys and the girl on the ground, close enough that Chase's next shove landed on her instead. She staggered but didn't go down, and she didn't step aside. He shoved her again, harder, and this time she did fall, catching the worst of it across her shoulder and hip, the same hip that had never fully healed. Even on the ground, she kept one arm stretched out toward Daisy, holding her back and out of reach. Her breath coming in short, ragged pulls against the pain. That was when Jake Reyes came around the corner of the concession stand at a dead run. He had pulled into the lot 4 minutes early, the way he always tried to, and had seen the shape of it from 200 feet out. 3 boys, his daughter on the ground, and an old woman putting her own body between them and Daisy. He didn't call out first. He closed the distance fast and silent, boots hitting gravel hard, and by the time Chase Bowen turned around, Jake was already there, one hand closing hard around the boy's wrist mid-swing before it could land on Odessa a second time. "That's done," Jake said. 3 words. He didn't raise his voice past that. Chase tried to pull free, and couldn't. "She's not even anybody," Chase said, and Jake's grip tightened just enough to make the point without hurting him. "She's the only reason my daughter doesn't have a mark on her right now," Jake said. "Sit down. All 3 of you. Nobody's going anywhere until somebody's parents get here." The boys sat on the curb behind the concession stand, without another word, the bravado gone out of all 3 of them at once. Riley Coots wouldn't look up from his shoes, and Cody Ferris had gone pale enough that he looked like he might be sick. Jake knelt first beside Odessa, who was trying badly to push herself upright with one arm that clearly wasn't working right anymore. "Ma'am, don't move yet," he said. "You're hurt." Odessa's voice came out thin but steady. "I've had worse falls off a piano bench," she whispered, though the gray color in her face said otherwise. Daisy, still shaking, had crawled over and pressed herself against Odessa's good side, and the old woman's free hand found the girl's hair without needing to be asked, smoothing it back the same way she used to calm a student before a recital. Gary Bowen arrived 12 minutes later, called by his son the moment Jake let the boys use their phones, and he came in already talking before his car door had finished closing. "I don't know what you think happened here," he said, "but you don't put your hands on my son." Jake didn't stand up from beside Odessa right away. When he did, he kept his voice level. "Your son shoved a 79-year-old woman to the ground twice, in front of 6 witnesses and a security camera mounted on that shed," Jake said. "I put my hand on his wrist for about 4 seconds to stop a 3rd hit. That's the whole of it." Gary Bowen's confidence wavered visibly, the way confidence does when it runs into something it can't talk its way around. His eyes flicking toward the camera bracket bolted above the shed door as though noticing it for the first time. "We'll see what the school says," he tried. "You'll see what the sheriff's department says first," Jake said, "because I already called them, and an ambulance is 4 minutes out for the woman your son knocked down twice." Nobody on that curb spoke after that. Nobody moved. Nobody looked at anybody else, waiting to see how badly the afternoon was actually going to end. Gary Bowen crossed his arms and said nothing further, and for the first time in years his son looked over at him for backup and found none coming. By the time the ambulance pulled away with Odessa strapped carefully to a gurney, a small crowd of parents from the after-school program had gathered at the edge of the lot, phones out, having caught the tail end of it from their cars. None of them had seen the shove itself, but all of them had seen an old woman being loaded into an ambulance and a leather-clad stranger standing guard over a shaking 9-year-old. And by that evening some version of the story had reached most of Pinewood Falls. Most of it half right, and getting more accurate by the hour as the actual witnesses started talking. Engines. That was the sound filling the Pinewood Falls Hospital parking lot by 7 that evening, word having traveled through the chapter the way it always did, once Jake made 2 phone calls from the emergency room waiting area. 30-some members of the local Hells Angels chapter, along with riders from 2 neighboring counties, filled the lot before visiting hours ended, not to make a scene, but because a woman none of them had ever met had taken a beating meant for one of their own children, and nobody in that club considered that a debt that could go unpaid. A member named Ruthie Alvarez, who'd spent 18 years as an ER nurse before she retired, walked straight past the front desk to check the chart herself. A fractured wrist, deep bruising along the hip that hadn't fully healed from an old injury, but nothing that wouldn't mend given time, and a bed that wasn't a cot in a cinderblock shed. A rider named Sal Marchetti, built like a door, spent most of that evening simply standing outside Odessa's hospital room, arms crossed, telling anyone from the press or the parks department who came asking questions that they'd need to go through him first. Word of what had happened at Meadowbrook had already reached the church by the time the second wave of riders arrived, and the pastor, who hadn't seen his old pianist in 11 months, showed up at the hospital that same night, ashamed and apologizing before he'd even reached her bedside. And Odessa, half-drugged on pain medication, told him the same thing she'd told everyone else that evening, that it truly hadn't been any trouble at all. Ruthie Alvarez sat with her past midnight, long after visiting hours technically ended, holding her uninjured hand and telling her more than once that this was over now, that nobody was putting her back in that shed. Odessa May Coleman had not had a single visitor in the 11 months since she'd started sleeping behind that concession stand, and that evening her small hospital room filled past its capacity with leather and quiet gratitude, one rider at a time, each of them thanking her for something she still insisted hadn't been any trouble at all. A teenage girl none of them recognized, one of Odessa's former students grown up and long moved away, had seen the stories shared online by a cousin and drove 2 hours that same night just to sit in the hallway outside, unwilling to leave until she'd had the chance to say thank you in person. Nobody made her go back to that shed. By the time she was discharged 3 days later, the chapter had already covered the deposit on a 1-bedroom apartment 2 blocks from the church where she used to play, paid the first 6 months outright, and moved in a second-hand upright piano that Sal Marchetti's wife had tracked down through a classifieds listing the same week. Daisy Reyes chose the paint color for Odessa's new front door herself, a soft blue that Odessa said reminded her of the choir robes from 30 years back. The church board, mortified once the full story reached them, offered to reinstate her as pianist the following Sunday, and Odessa accepted on the condition that nobody make a fuss about it in front of the congregation, a condition the pastor broke within the first 5 minutes of the service anyway, dedicating the opening hymn to her by name before she'd even taken her seat at the bench. Chase Bowen was suspended from school for the rest of the semester, pending a juvenile hearing, ordered into counseling, and required to complete community service hours, most of which, at his own father's insistence once the shame of it caught up to him, ended up going toward park maintenance and the very shed Odessa had once called home. Riley Coots and Cody Ferris faced lighter consequences through the school, though both sets of parents showed up at the following TAW meeting considerably quieter than they had been the year before. Gary Bowen did not run for re-election to the town council that fall. Odessa started giving Daisy piano lessons on Saturday mornings before the second recital season came back around, refusing payment the same way she'd refused it for 40 years, telling Jake the only fee she'd ever accept was a standing invitation to Sunday dinner. which he gave her without hesitation. Daisy, who had spent a year believing the coat on her back, and the quiet in her house made her invisible to everyone at that school, sat at Odessa's second-hand upright most Saturdays now, picking out scales with the same nervous concentration Odessa had spent 38 years coaxing out of children twice removed from her own family, and every bit as much hers for it. Jake Riaz never missed another 4:15 pickup, though now there were 2 stops on the way. One for his daughter, and one for the woman the whole chapter had quietly started calling their own. He kept the security footage from that afternoon on his phone for exactly as long as it took the sheriff's department to close their file, and deleted it the same day, telling Daisy there was no reason to keep looking backward at the worst 4 minutes of a much better story. Odessa May Coleman put her body between a stranger's daughter and 3 fists twice her size, and asked nothing in return. She had spent 11 months believing the world had stopped needing her the day her savings ran out. 30-some Hell's Angels made sure she never had to stand alone again. If you believe kindness like hers deserves to be repaid, tell us where you're watching from tonight. I read every comment.